Hello and welcome. You've arrived at a place that gently slows the world down, a place where busy thoughts can soften and tired minds are free to rest. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Feel the weight of your head sink gently into your pillow and allow your eyelids to grow heavy, so wonderfully heavy. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey through time, but there's no need to rush, no need to go anywhere at all. You're exactly where you need to be, right here, right now, as we explore one of fashion's most curious transformations. Tonight's story begins not in a Parisian boutique or on a glamorous runway, but on windswept battlefields over 1,000 years ago. It's a tale of warriors and kings, of power and privilege, of how something designed for the brutality of combat slowly transformed into a symbol of elegance and desire. We're going to discover the hidden evolution of high heels, tracing their remarkable path from the stirrups of 10th century Persian cavalry riders through the glittering halls of King Louis XIV's Versailles, all the way to the spotlit catwalks of today's fashion capitals. So settle in deeper, let your breathing slow and steady, and prepare to drift through centuries of history. Each word is a gentle step backward through time, each image a soft watercolor, bleeding into the next. There's nowhere to be, nothing to do, except listen and let the story carry you away. Our journey begins in the vast stretches of 10th century Persia, where the air shimmers with heat and the earth stretches endlessly in shades of ochre and amber. Picture the landscape, if you will, those rolling plains where dust devils dance in the afternoon sun and the horizon seems to go on forever. This is where the high heel was born, not from vanity, but from necessity. The Persian Empire commanded the largest and most formidable cavalry force the world had ever seen. These weren't just soldiers on horses. They were artists of warfare, masters of a fighting technique that required incredible balance, precision, and courage. Imagine a rider standing tall in his stirrups, his horse galloping at full speed across uneven terrain, the thunder of hooves creating a rhythm like a heartbeat beneath him. In his hands, a bow drawn taut, an arrow nocked and ready to fly toward a distant target. But here's the challenge that faced these warriors. How do you maintain your balance while standing on a galloping horse? How do you keep your feet secure in stirrups when every muscle in your body is focused on drawing a bowstring, on tracking a moving enemy, on the split-second decisions that mean the difference between victory and defeat? The answer came in the form of a boot called the galesh. Feel the weight of that word on your tongue, galesh. Soft and deliberate. These boots featured a raised heel, typically 1 to 2 inches high, crafted from thick leather that had been worked until it was supple yet strong. The leather carried the rich, earthy smell of tanning oils, of animal hide, transformed through patient craftsmanship. When a rider slipped his foot into the stirrup, that heel would catch on the metal frame, creating a wedge, a lock, that kept the foot planted firmly in place. Imagine running your fingers over one of these ancient boots. The leather would be cool to the touch at first, warming slowly beneath your hand. The heel itself would be firm, constructed from layers of leather, compressed and shaped, then sometimes reinforced with wood from the hardy trees that grew in the mountain regions. Some heels were wrapped in fabric, others left bare, showing the natural grain and texture of the hide. The stitching would be visible, each thread placed with purpose, creating patterns that were both decorative and functional, reinforcing stress points where the boot would flex with each movement of the rider's foot. These weren't delicate shoes, they were instruments of war, as essential to a Persian cavalryman as his sword or his bow. The sound they made was distinctive too. Picture a warrior striding across a stone courtyard in the early morning, the click and thud of those heeled boots echoing off ancient walls, announcing his presence, his readiness, his skill. That sound meant power. It meant a man who had mastered the art of mounted archery, one of the most difficult and prestigious military techniques of the age. As the centuries rolled forward like waves lapping at a shore, the practical heel of the Persian warrior began to catch the eye of those beyond the battlefield. By the late 16th century, Persia was ruled by Shah Abbas I, a leader known for his diplomatic acumen as much as his military might. Abbas understood that influence could be won not just through conquest, but through cultural exchange, through dazzling foreign courts with the sophistication and refinement of Persian civilization. And so, in the year 1599, Abbas sent diplomatic missions westward across the Silk Roads and mountain passes toward the courts of Russia, Germany, and Spain. Picture these emissaries arriving in European capitals, their appearance causing whispers to ripple through throne rooms like wind through wheat fields. They wore robes of the finest silk, shimmering in jewel tones, deep emeralds and sapphires, rich crimsons that seemed to hold the light of sunset. Their clothing was embroidered with gold and silver thread, creating patterns that caught the candlelight and seemed almost to move of their own accord. But it was their footwear that truly captured the imagination of European nobility. These Persian dignitaries wore heeled boots and slippers that elevated them quite literally above their hosts. Some heels reached as high as 5 inches, crafted with an attention to detail that bordered on the obsessive. The finest examples were covered in brocade, a heavy fabric woven with metallic threads that added weight and luxury. Others featured intricate silver buckles, shaped like crescents or flowers, catching and reflecting light with every step. The message these shoes conveyed was unmistakable. Here were men of such wealth and status that they could afford to wear footwear completely impractical for walking any distance. The heels announced that their wearers had servants to carry them through muddy streets, that they spent their time in palaces and not on common roads, that they belonged to a class so elevated that even gravity seemed negotiable. European aristocrats, ever eager to display their own wealth and power, were captivated. Within decades, heeled shoes began appearing at courts across the continent. The fashion spread like ripples across a pond, touching England, France, the Germanic states, and beyond. Men of nobility and ambition began commissioning their own elevated footwear, each trying to outdo the other in height and ornamentation. Imagine a cobbler's workshop in early 17th century Paris, the air thick with the smell of leather and beeswax. Apprentices would carefully cut patterns, their fingers stained with dye. Master craftsmen would shape wooden heels on their lathes, the steady rhythm of their work creating a meditation of its own. Each shoe was a small masterpiece, taking days or even weeks to complete. With heels covered in the finest materials the client could afford, the leather dyed in rich colors, buckles commissioned from silversmiths, the whole assemblage designed to make a statement about the wearer's place in society. But no one, absolutely no one, used heeled shoes to assert power quite like Louis XIV of France. Born in 1638, Louis would rule France for an astonishing 72 years, earning the title of the Sun King for the way all of French society seemed to orbit around him. And just as the sun commands attention without effort, Louis understood that even the smallest details of appearance could be wielded as tools of control. Picture, if you will, the Palace of Versailles in its full glory. It's not yet dawn, and the vast marble halls are still shrouded in that particular quality of pre-morning darkness. But slowly, gradually, candles are being lit throughout the palace, hundreds upon hundreds of them, their flames multiplying the light through enormous mirrors until the entire structure seems to glow from within. The air carries the scent of beeswax, of perfume, of fresh flowers that have been arranged in elaborate displays throughout the state rooms. And now, imagine Louis himself preparing for the day. His attendants help him into stockings of the finest silk, so delicate they could snag on the slightest rough edge. Over these go breeches of rich velvet, perhaps in deep burgundy or royal blue, embroidered with threads of gold that catch the candlelight. A coat follows, its fabric so heavy with decoration it seems to stand on its own, the weight of privilege made manifest in fabric and thread. But the pièce de résistance, the element that completes the transformation from man to monarch, are the shoes, and not just any shoes, but ones with heels covered in scarlet leather, dyed a red so vibrant it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The red of Louis's heels wasn't just any red. It was a specific costly shade achieved through an expensive and time-consuming dyeing process. This red announced that its wearer's feet would never touch common dirt, that he existed in a realm elevated above the mundane concerns of ordinary life. Feel the texture of these shoes in your mind. The leather would be impossibly smooth, worked until it felt almost like fabric against the skin. The heel itself, perhaps 4 inches tall, would be carved from cork and wood, then wrapped carefully in that precious red leather. Every seam would be invisible, every stitch perfect, because these shoes were made by the finest craftsmen in France, men who understood that a single flaw could mean the loss of royal patronage. But Louis went further. In the early 1670s, he issued an edict that would cement the red heel as the ultimate symbol of royal favor. Only members of his court who had been officially presented to him were permitted to wear shoes with red heels. Suddenly, footwear became a visible marker of status that could be read across a crowded room. You could tell at a glance who had the king's favor and who did not, who belonged to the inner circle and who remained forever outside it. Picture a court ball at Versailles, the great hall of mirrors, that architectural marvel where 17 arched windows face 17 matching mirrors, multiplying candlelight into something almost supernatural. Music drifts through the space, the delicate notes of harpsichord and violin weaving together like golden thread. And there, moving through the crowd, you can identify the most privileged courtiers by the flash of red at their heels as they bow, as they turn, as they dance. Those red heels made a particular sound on the palace's marble floors, a sharp, authoritative click that announced approach, that demanded attention. The French even developed a term for those without red heels, pied plat, flat foot, a label that carried the weight of social exclusion. And for the young men privileged enough to wear them, those red heels were everything. They were nicknamed Les Talons Rouges, and they wore their elevation with pride bordering on arrogance. The heels themselves were often decorated with even more elaborate designs. Louis's personal shoes sometimes featured tiny painted scenes of his military victories, entire battles compressed onto a surface no larger than a playing card. Imagine the patience required for such work. An artist hunched over a wooden heel in lamplight, mixing pigments to capture the drama of cannon fire and cavalry charges, all so that a king could literally stand upon his triumphs. For decades, high heels remained firmly in the realm of masculine fashion. But as the 17th century drew to a close and the 18th century dawned, something curious began to happen. Women, intrigued by the power and status that heels conveyed, started adopting them for their own wardrobes. At first, this was often done as a deliberate attempt to appropriate masculine authority. If men could use height to command respect, why couldn't women do the same? But as women's heels grew more common, a slow differentiation began to emerge. Men's heels started to become chunkier, squarer, more obviously practical. They appeared primarily on riding boots or formal dress boots, maintaining some connection to their original equestrian purpose. Women's heels, by contrast, grew narrower, more delicate, more ornamental. They curved in elegant lines that emphasized the arch of the foot attached to slippers and dress shoes rather than boots. By the 1720s and 30s, a curious thing happened. Men, influenced by the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and practicality, began to see high heels as frivolous, as irrational indulgence. The very qualities that had once made heels desirable, their impracticality and their association with leisure and wealth, now made them suspect. Real men, the thinking went, should focus on substance over style, on utility over ornamentation. And so, gradually, men stepped down from their elevated shoes. By around 1730, it was increasingly uncommon to see fashionable men in high heels outside of specific contexts like riding or military dress. The heel had become, almost overnight in historical terms, a feminine accessory. The French Revolution of 1789 delivered what might have been the final blow. The red heels of the aristocracy became symbols of everything the revolution sought to destroy: inherited privilege, ostentatious display, the gap between the wealthy and the working poor. Revolutionary fervor demanded equality, and equality meant flat soles and simple dress. For a time, high heels virtually disappeared from European fashion entirely. But fashion, like history itself, moves in cycles. What falls out of favor in one era often returns, transformed in another. The 19th century saw high heels gradually creep back into women's wardrobes, though they remained relatively modest in height. By the mid-1800s, they were back in full force, averaging around 2.5 inches, practical enough for the increasingly mobile lives of urban women, but elevated enough to make a statement. The 20th century, however, would see the high heel reach new heights, both literally and figuratively. The catalyst was technology. For centuries, heels had been made primarily of wood, sometimes covered in leather or fabric, but fundamentally wooden. This limited how thin and tall they could be made before snapping under a wearer's weight. Everything changed in 1954, when an Italian designer named Roger Vivier, working for the house of Christian Dior, invented a revolutionary heel design. By inserting a thin steel rod into the heel's core, Vivier created a structure that could be impossibly slender and yet remain strong enough to support a person's full weight. The stiletto heel was born. Picture these new heels. They rose 4, 5, even 6 inches high, but their profile was like a needle, a spike, a line so thin it seemed to defy physics. The Italian word stiletto means a small, pointed dagger, and these heels earn their name through their sharp, dangerous elegance. They transformed the silhouette of anyone who wore them, forcing a particular way of walking, a roll of the hips, a careful placement of each step that read as intensely feminine and somehow powerful. The 1950s and 60s saw stilettos everywhere. Movie stars like Marilyn Monroe and Audrey Hepburn wore them on screen and off, cementing their association with glamour and sophistication. Fashion magazines filled their pages with images of women in heels, standing taller, seeming somehow more authoritative, more present, more themselves. But stilettos weren't universally beloved. They went through periods of falling from fashion, replaced by chunkier heels in the 1970s, by platforms, by more practical designs. Yet they always came back. By the early 21st century, stilettos had reclaimed their position as the ultimate power shoe. Designers like Christian Louboutin, with his signature red soles, deliberately evoked the red heels of Louis XIV, creating a direct line between the 17th century royal privilege and modern luxury. Today, high heels dominate fashion runways from New York to Paris to Milan. They've evolved into countless variations: kitten heels and block heels, wedges and platforms, heels covered in crystals, or carved into sculptural shapes that barely seem like shoes at all. Some designers create heels that look more like architectural models, impossible structures that somehow still function as footwear. Walk into any major fashion show today, and you'll see the direct descendants of those 10th century Persian cavalry boots. Models stride down runways in heels that tower 6 or 7 inches high, navigating those narrow catwalks with a grace that comes from hours of practice. The lights catch the shoes, cameras flash, and for a moment, those heels become the story, the statement, the message. The cycle has come full around in curious ways. Once purely masculine, then almost exclusively feminine, high heels are now being reclaimed by people of all genders who see in them a form of self-expression, a way to stand taller, to command a room, to make a statement without saying a word. Fashion designers increasingly show heels in their menswear collections, and slowly, tentatively, the heel is becoming once again what it was always meant to be: a symbol of power worn by anyone bold enough to take that step upward. And so, our journey through time comes to its end. From the dusty battlefields of ancient Persia to the mirrored halls of Versailles, from the practical needs of warriors to the aesthetic desires of modern fashionistas, the high heel has traveled a remarkable path. It's a reminder that fashion is never just about clothes or shoes, but about power, identity, and the stories we tell about ourselves. And now, as the first story slowly fades, let's take a gentle breath together. Allow its echoes to drift away like stardust settling in the dark. Because just beyond this quiet moment, another story is waiting, another place to wander, another soft world to step into. So relax a little deeper and let us continue into our next gentle journey. Our story begins not in a boutique or on a runway, but aboard a military vessel somewhere in the year 1913. Picture the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly in every direction, the water a deep blue-gray under an overcast sky. A naval ship cuts through the waves, its hull creaking with that particular rhythm known only to those who spend their lives at sea. Below deck, in quarters cramped and dim, sailors prepare for another day of duty. Feel the fabric in your mind, pure cotton, knitted in a way that creates a slight gyve, a gentle stretch. The material is lightweight, almost impossibly so compared to the heavy wool uniforms these men wear over it. The color is an off-white, not the brilliant white of fresh snow, but something softer, warmer, like cream or the palest morning light filtering through mist. This is the T-shirt in its original form, though no one calls it that yet. It's simply an undershirt, part of the standard issue uniform for sailors in the United States Navy. Run your fingers in your imagination along the hem of one of these garments. The stitching is simple but sturdy, designed to withstand countless washings in salt water, endless hours of wear under the tropical sun. The neckline is crew-cut, meaning it comes up to the base of the neck in a gentle curve. No collar, no buttons, no ornament of any kind. The sleeves are short, ending midway down the upper arm, leaving the forearms free for the endless tasks that fill a sailor's day. These shirts were born from necessity. Before 1913, sailors wore one-piece Union suits, those strange garments that covered the body from neck to ankle in a single piece of fabric. But in the heat of tropical waters, in the suffocating air of submarine interiors, in the engine rooms where temperatures soared past bearable, these full-body undergarments became torture. Men would cut their Union suits in half just to survive the heat, creating makeshift tops and bottoms. The Navy, seeing this practical adaptation, made it official. The T-shirt, as a separate garment, was born. Imagine being on that ship as the sun climbs higher, transforming the deck into a griddle of wood and metal. The sailors, working in parties to swab the decks, to adjust the rigging, to perform the 1,000 tasks that keep a vessel seaworthy, begin to peel away their heavy wool jackets. Underneath, these white cotton undershirts cling to their bodies, soaked through with perspiration, but offering blessed relief from the suffocating layers. The fabric, dampened by sweat and salt spray, becomes almost translucent in the bright sunlight, revealing the shapes and shadows of the bodies beneath. This was revolutionary, though no one knew it yet. For the first time, an undergarment designed to be hidden was being worn in plain sight. The practical needs of naval life had inadvertently created a new way of dressing, though it would be decades before anyone thought of these shirts as anything other than underwear accidentally exposed. Listen to the sounds of that naval life. The slap of rope against mast, the constant whisper and roar of ocean waves, the calls of seabirds following the ship. And underneath it all, the softer sounds, fabric rustling against skin, the wet slap of laundry being hung to dry on makeshift lines strung across the deck, the quiet conversations of men in their bunks discussing the comfort of these new undershirts compared to the suffocating Union suits of years past. As the decades rolled forward, these simple white shirts began to escape their military origins. World War I came and went, sending millions of young men through military service, where they discovered the comfort and practicality of the T-shirt. When they returned home, many brought these habits with them. The shirts found their way into civilian life, not yet as fashion, but as function. Picture a dock in 1925, early morning in New York Harbor. The air carries that particular scent of industrial waterfronts, salt and fish, diesel fuel and tar, the green smell of algae growing on pilings, the metallic tang of cargo containers. Stevedores arrive for their shifts, men with broad shoulders and calloused hands, dressed for hard labor in the summer heat. Many wear white t-shirts, though they still think of them as undershirts, practical garments that can be washed easily, that don't restrict movement, that cost far less than proper dress shirts. Feel the texture of these working men's t-shirts. They're coarser than the naval issue, made from cheaper cotton, already yellowing slightly from repeated washings in harsh soap. The fabric pills where it rubs against itself, under the arms and along the sides. Some show patches of discoloration from sweat and hard work, the white turned gray or brown in spots. These aren't garments to be seen in, they're tools, as much a part of a laborer's equipment as his gloves or his lunch pail. During the Great Depression, the t-shirt found an even larger audience. Money was scarce, and a t-shirt cost pennies compared to a proper button-up shirt. Farmers wore them in the fields, miners wore them underground, factory workers wore them at their machines. The t-shirt became synonymous with physical labor, with working-class masculinity, with men who earned their living through the strength of their backs and the skill of their hands. But these were still hidden garments in polite society. A man might wear his t-shirt while working, while at home, while among other working men. But to appear in public, in town, at church, at any social occasion, wearing only a t-shirt would have been scandalous. It would have been like appearing in your underwear, which technically it still was. The t-shirt lived in this liminal space, visible but not acknowledged, worn but not discussed, practical but improper. Everything changed in 1951. The year a play became a film, and a film became a cultural earthquake. The production was A Streetcar Named Desire, directed by Elia Kazan, adapted from Tennessee Williams' Pulitzer Prize-winning play, and at its center was a 27-year-old actor named Marlon Brando, playing a character named Stanley Kowalski. Transport yourself to a movie theater that autumn. The lights dim, the curtains part, and the screen flickers to life, showing the humid, decaying beauty of New Orleans. And there, in the very first scenes, is Brando, Stanley Kowalski, wearing a t-shirt, not as an undershirt beneath proper clothing, but as the clothing itself. A t-shirt fitted so closely to his body it seems painted on, revealing every contour, every muscle, every shadow. The costume designer, Lucinda Ballard, had created these shirts specifically for Brando. She'd been inspired watching construction workers and utility crews in Manhattan, men so covered in sweat and grime that their undershirts clung to their bodies like second skins. She wanted to capture that raw, physical presence for Stanley, so she took simple white t-shirts, washed them again and again until they shrank, then had them sewn tight down the back to achieve the perfect body-hugging fit. Feel the fabric of Stanley's t-shirt in your imagination. It's not the loose, comfortable fit of a proper undershirt. This is constrictive, deliberate, designed to put the body on display. The cotton has been washed so many times it's become incredibly soft, almost silky, but also thin enough to hint at skin tone beneath. In some scenes, the shirt is pristine white, fresh and clean. In others, it's stained with sweat, torn at the shoulder where his wife Stella has scratched him during a fight, the fabric stretched and distorted from the violence of his movements. The impact on audiences was immediate and profound. Here was masculinity presented in an entirely new way. Not the sophisticated gentleman in a well-tailored suit, not the cowboy in his frontier clothes, not the soldier in his decorated uniform. This was something primal, sexual, dangerous. The t-shirt, that humble undergarment, had become charged with meaning. It suggested a man who didn't care about social niceties, who lived by his body and his appetites, who was more animal than civilized being. Critics were shocked. Some theaters reported complaints from viewers who found the film indecent. The Catholic Legion of Decency issued warnings, but audiences couldn't look away. Brando's performance, physical and emotionally raw in ways American cinema had never seen, transfixed viewers. And that T-shirt became inseparable from the character, from the performance, from the revolution he represented. Picture that famous scene, the one that has been endlessly photographed and parodied. Stanley at the bottom of a staircase, his T-shirt torn, calling out for his wife, "Stella! Stella!" The camera lingers on Brando's body, the T-shirt clinging to his torso, revealing the rise and fall of his breathing, the tension in his shoulders. This wasn't accidental. The director, the costume designer, the cinematographer, all were complicit in making the male body an object of desire and fascination. And the T-shirt was the tool that made it possible. By the end of 1951, sales of white T-shirts in America had reached $180 million. Men who'd never thought twice about wearing an undershirt in public suddenly saw it differently. The T-shirt had become, almost overnight, a symbol of rugged masculinity, of working-class authenticity, of a kind of rough sexual appeal that existed outside the boundaries of polite society. But if Marlon Brando made the T-shirt sexual, it was James Dean who made it the uniform of youth rebellion. 4 years after Streetcar, in the autumn of 1955, another film appeared that would cement the white T-shirt's place in cultural history, Rebel Without a Cause. Dean played Jim Stark, a troubled teenager newly arrived in Los Angeles, trying desperately to fit in while feeling fundamentally alienated from his parents and their world. The costume designer, Moss Mabry, had spent days at Los Angeles high schools, observing what actual teenagers wore. He'd studied photographs in Life magazine showing groups of college students. He wanted authenticity, wanted to capture how young people actually dressed when they weren't being told what to wear by their elders. The result was iconic: blue jeans, a red windbreaker jacket, and underneath, a simple white T-shirt. Not fitted as tightly as Brando's, but still form-fitting, still youthful, still suggesting a body comfortable in its skin. The white of the T-shirt created a visual anchor, a blank canvas that somehow contained all of Jim Stark's confusion and yearning. Feel that T-shirt in your mind. It's made of slightly heavier cotton than Stanley Kowalski's, a jersey knit that has more body, more structure. It's clean at the film's opening, representing Jim's attempt to start fresh in a new city. But as the story progresses, as the night spirals into tragedy and revelation, the shirt becomes rumpled, slightly soiled, pulled askew by the emotional and physical turmoil of the plot. By the film's devastating conclusion, that white T-shirt has witnessed everything, absorbed everything, become a silent testament to one terrible, transformative night. What made Dean's T-shirt different from Brando's was what it represented. Stanley Kowalski was a grown man, powerful, sexual, dangerous. Jim Stark was a boy, vulnerable, searching, wounded. His white T-shirt wasn't about sex or power. It was about authenticity, about refusing to dress like your parents, about creating an identity separate from the adults who seemed to understand nothing of what it meant to be young in the 1950s. The film was released on October 27, 1955, less than a month after James Dean died in a car crash at the age of 24. The tragedy amplified everything. Dean became a martyr, his youthful beauty and talent frozen forever at that perfect moment. And his style in Rebel Without a Cause became the template for teenage rebellion for generations to come. Imagine yourself as a teenager in 1956 walking into a store and buying your first white t-shirt specifically to wear as an outer garment. The act feels transgressive, exciting, like you're claiming something that belongs to you and your generation alone. Your parents might disapprove, might call it underwear, might insist you put on a proper shirt. But that's exactly the point. The t-shirt has become a badge, a declaration that you're part of something new, something your elders don't and can't understand. From those breakthrough moments in the 1950s, the white t-shirt began its final transformation into the global icon it is today. The 1960s and 70s saw the rise of graphic t-shirts, as screen printing technology made it possible to add images, slogans, and artwork to that blank canvas of cotton. Bands like the Rolling Stones created logo t-shirts that fans wore as badges of allegiance. Political movements printed their messages on t-shirts, turning bodies into walking billboards for causes. The simple white t-shirt spawned countless variations, but remained the foundation, the essential form from which all others derived. By the 1980s and 90s, high-fashion designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier and Vivienne Westwood were incorporating t-shirts into their couture collections. Supermodels like Kate Moss made the plain white tee paired with jeans into the definition of casual elegance. The garment that began as military-issue underwear had completed its journey to become, paradoxically, both the most basic and the most versatile item in the global wardrobe. Picture a white t-shirt today hanging in a closet anywhere in the world. It might cost $5 or $500, might be thick organic cotton or gossamer thin luxury fabric, might be perfectly white or aged to a vintage cream. But its DNA traces directly back to those sailors on 1913 naval vessels, to those dock workers in the Depression, to Stanley Kowalski prowling his New Orleans apartment, to Jim Stark standing uncertain and beautiful in his California high school. The white t-shirt has become what fashion theorists call a democratic garment, worn by everyone regardless of age, gender, wealth, or status. It can signify rebellion or conformity, luxury or economy, care or carelessness, all depending on how it's worn, what it's paired with, what it means to the person wearing it. Few items of clothing have achieved such complete transformation, such total ubiquity, such enduring power. As the second story gently comes to rest, let everything become a little quieter. Your breathing, your thoughts, even the space around you. Our story begins not in dreary London streets, but in the blazing deserts of ancient Egypt, over 4,000 years ago. Picture the Nile Valley, that ribbon of green cutting through endless ochre sand. The sun hangs in a pale blue sky, merciless and eternal, transforming the air itself into something you can almost taste, metallic and dry against your tongue. The heat doesn't just warm, it oppresses, it overwhelms, it demands respect. And there, moving slowly through this landscape like a sacred procession, comes a figure of ultimate power, a pharaoh perhaps, or a high priest. But you don't see them first. What catches your eye is the umbrella, the parasol, held aloft by a servant walking behind. It's enormous, this shade provider, constructed from palm leaves woven together and attached to a long wooden pole. The leaves have been carefully selected, dried to just the right degree of suppleness, then lashed to a frame with linen cord. The whole construction creates a pool of precious shadow, a portable piece of night in the midst of day. Feel the texture of those palm leaves in your imagination. They're not soft, not quite. There's a papery quality to them, a slight roughness against the fingertips. The wooden pole is smooth from handling, worn by countless servants who have carried this burden, this honor. Because in ancient Egypt, the umbrella was never just practical, it was sacred. It represented the vault of heaven itself, the sky goddess Nut, spreading her protection over the chosen ones below. To carry an umbrella, or more accurately to have one carried over you, was to announce yourself as someone touched by the divine. The colors were specific too. Royal umbrellas came in red, yellow, and blue, each shade achieved through careful dyeing processes, using minerals and plants whose names have been lost to time. And the rule was absolute. No one of importance ever held their own umbrella. That would defeat the entire purpose. The umbrella announced that you were so elevated, so precious, that others existed solely to ensure your comfort. Now, let your mind drift eastward across the ancient Silk Roads to China in the centuries before the Common Era. Here, umbrellas evolved in fascinating ways. Picture a Chinese emperor's procession in, say, the 10th century before Christ. The emperor rides in an elaborate chariot, and above him rises not one umbrella, but 4, stacked one atop the other in tiers, creating a towering edifice of silk and bamboo that catches the light like a beacon. These Chinese umbrellas were marvels of engineering. Craftsmen had discovered how to waterproof silk using wax and lacquer, creating the world's first true rain umbrellas, not just parasols. The bamboo frames were lightweight yet strong, and Chinese inventors had even developed a collapsible mechanism, allowing the umbrella to fold and unfold like a fan, like a flower opening to the sun. Run your fingers in your imagination along one of these silk canopies. The fabric is impossibly smooth, cool to the touch despite the warmth of the day. You can feel the slight stiffness of the wax coating. See how water would bead and roll off rather than soaking through. But again, as in Egypt, the umbrella in China spoke of status. Yellow umbrellas belonged exclusively to the emperor. This wasn't a suggestion or a tradition. It was law. To possess a yellow umbrella without imperial permission was to commit an offense punishable by death. High-ranking officials might be granted red or blue umbrellas, each color a precise indicator of rank in the vast bureaucracy of the empire. Commoners could have umbrellas, yes, but theirs were made of oiled paper and bamboo, functional but deliberately plain, carrying none of the silk and precious metals that adorned the umbrellas of power. In Persia, in India, across the ancient world, the pattern repeated. Umbrellas meant royalty, meant divine favor, meant a person so important that even the elements themselves must not be allowed to touch them. The more elaborate your umbrella, the more servants required to carry it, the greater your status. Some rulers in Burma had parasols with 24 tiers, requiring teams of men to hoist and carry, announcing their approach like a silk-covered mountain moving through the streets. As trade routes opened and empires expanded, the umbrella slowly made its way westward. By the late 16th century, Catherine de' Medici arrived in France from Italy to marry King Henry II, and in her luggage, among the finery and jewels, came her parasols. These weren't the waterproof Chinese versions, but delicate things of silk and feathers, designed purely for shade, for protecting the fashionable pale complexion that marked a woman as too refined for outdoor labor. Picture a French court lady in 1650, strolling through the gardens at Versailles. She's dressed in layers upon layers of silk and brocade, her face painted white with lead powder, her hair towering in the elaborate style of the era. And over her head, held by either herself or a servant, floats a parasol. It's small by ancient standards, perhaps 2 feet across, covered in pale pink silk embroidered with silver thread. The handle is carved ivory, cool and smooth, beneath her gloved fingers. This, in 17th and 18th century Europe, was the umbrella's identity. It was a feminine accessory, as much a part of a ladies' ensemble as her fan or her gloves. It spoke of delicacy, of a constitution so refined that even sunshine might prove too harsh. Men, real men, had no use for such things. They wore hats, if necessary, or simply endured whatever weather Providence provided, secure in their masculine fortitude. By the early 18th century, as waterproofing techniques reached Europe from Asia, some umbrellas could actually repel rain. French merchants began producing what they called parapluies, literally against rain, distinguished from the parasol or against sun. These were heavier affairs, the silk coated in oil that gave the fabric a peculiar sheen and a distinctive smell, slightly rancid, vaguely chemical. The frames were reinforced with whalebone ribs, flexible yet strong, giving the umbrella a characteristic dome shape that could shed water efficiently. But even these rain umbrellas remained strictly feminine in England. To see a woman carrying one was unremarkable, even fashionable. To see a man with one would have been cause for comment, for raised eyebrows, for whispered conversations behind gloved hands. Real English gentlemen took carriages or sedan chairs when it rained. Only women, with their supposedly weaker constitutions, needed the crutch of an umbrella. And then came Jonas Hanway. Picture London in the early 1750s. The city is growing rapidly, transforming from a medieval town into something approaching a modern metropolis. The streets are chaos. Horses and carriages compete with pedestrians for space. The air carries a complex perfume of coal smoke, horse manure, baking bread, and human sweat. And the weather, the weather. London is famous for its rain, that particular quality of English precipitation that's not quite a downpour, but more than a drizzle, a persistent dampness that seeps into clothing and bones alike. Into these streets, in 1750 or thereabouts, stepped Jonas Hanway. He was 38 years old, recently returned from 7 years of travel and trade in Russia and Persia. He'd seen the world, this Hanway. He'd negotiated with Persian merchants, survived harrowing journeys, built a successful business. And somewhere in his travels, probably in Persia where he'd witnessed the ancient tradition of ceremonial parasols, he'd acquired or designed his own umbrella. It was not a delicate thing. Hanway's umbrella was substantial, with a wooden shaft, perhaps 3 feet long, and a canopy made of heavy oiled silk stretched over whalebone ribs. The whole contraption weighed several pounds, requiring a firm grip to manage, especially in wind. The canopy was perhaps 3 feet across when opened, creating a dome of oiled fabric that made a distinctive sound in the rain, a gentle pattering like fingertips drumming on a tabletop. Now, imagine Hanway's first walk through London carrying this umbrella. Perhaps it's a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky seems to press down on the city like a heavy blanket. A light rain has begun, not enough to drive people indoors, but enough to be unpleasant. Most pedestrians hurry along, collars turned up, hats pulled low, accepting the wet as an inevitable part of urban life. The wealthy summon their carriages. The poor simply endure. And then here comes Jonas Hanway, walking at a leisurely pace, completely dry beneath his umbrella. The reaction is immediate. People stop and stare. Some point. Then comes the laughter, scattered at first, then building. Someone shouts something crude, questioning Hanway's masculinity. Another voice joins in, louder, suggesting he must be French, that most damning of insults in England at the time, still smarting from various wars and rivalries with its continental neighbor. But the fiercest opposition comes from an unexpected quarter, the hackney coachmen and sedan chair carriers. Feel for a moment the frustration of these men. Their entire livelihood depends on rain. When the skies open, business booms. People who would normally walk summon carriages instead. A rainy day might mean double or triple the normal income. And now, here's this Hanway fellow suggesting by his very existence that rain needn't be an obstacle, that a simple umbrella could provide all the protection one needed. The coachmen organize. When they spot Hanway approaching, they shout warnings to each other. Some simply jeer and hoot, making the same accusations of effeminacy and foreign influence that other Londoners level. But others go further. They pelt him with rubbish, with rotten vegetables, with whatever comes to hand. On at least one occasion, a coachman actually tries to run Hanway down, driving his carriage directly at the umbrella-carrying pedestrian. Hanway responds by thrashing the coachman with his umbrella, using his controversial accessory as a weapon, proving perhaps that umbrellas could embody masculine vigor after all. But the incident illustrates the genuine hostility he faced. This wasn't just social disapproval, it was active, sometimes violent resistance to what many Londoners saw as a threat to the natural order. Listen to the sounds of those encounters, the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones, the creak of carriage wheels, the shouts of the coachman, voices rough from years of outdoor work, calling Hanway Frenchy, or worse, the splatter of rotten fruit hitting oiled silk, the swish of Hanway's umbrella through the air as he defends himself, and underneath it all, the constant patter of rain, the soundtrack to this peculiar battle. And Hanway persists. Day after day, month after month, year after year, when it rains, out comes the umbrella. He's a stubborn man, Hanway, known for holding strong opinions about all sorts of things. He's virulently opposed to tea drinking, for instance, considering it a foreign corruption that weakens English character. He writes pamphlets about trade policy and prison reform. An umbrella is nothing compared to the other controversies he cheerfully embraces. The abuse continues for decades, 30 years, according to some accounts, of jeers and pelted vegetables and muttered insults. But something interesting happens. Other men, brave or practical or simply tired of arriving everywhere soaked, begin to follow Hanway's example. First a handful, then dozens. The umbrella shops that had served primarily female clients begin advertising gentlemen's models, sturdier and larger than the ladies' versions. The slang term Hanway enters the language as another word for umbrella, honoring the man who'd endured so much ridicule for such a simple innovation. By the late 1700s, the tide has shifted. It's still somewhat unusual to see a gentleman with an umbrella, but it's no longer cause for mob violence. The coachmen, realizing their battle is lost, grumble but accept the new reality. Umbrella makers proliferate, establishing shops throughout London. James Smith and Sons opens in 1830, selling umbrellas that combine the latest technological innovations. Steel ribs replacing whalebone, making the frames lighter and more flexible. Gingham and silk covers in a rainbow of colors. Handles carved from exotic woods and ivory, transforming the umbrella from pure utility into a fashion statement. Picture one of these improved umbrellas. The steel ribs, when the umbrella is closed, fold neatly along the shaft, creating a compact bundle perhaps 2 inches across. The silk covering, when unfurled, reveals a perfect dome, taut and symmetrical. The handle fits comfortably in the palm, weighted perfectly for balance. Opening the umbrella requires a firm push upward, a satisfying click as the mechanism locks into place. But even as umbrellas become more common, some holdouts remain. Beau Brummel, the famous dandy and arbiter of men's fashion, refuses to carry one, insisting that a true gentleman should simply take a sedan chair if rain threatens. The Duke of Wellington owns an umbrella with a rapier hidden in the handle, but forbids his officers from carrying them on the battlefield, issuing a standing order that umbrellas will not be opened in the presence of the enemy, though his guards may carry them on duty in London, and then comes the full reversal. By the Victorian era, by the middle 1800s, the umbrella has completed its transformation from social scandal to social necessity. A gentleman in London without his umbrella is now as improperly dressed as a gentleman without his hat or his gloves. The umbrella has become a mark of respectability, of belonging to the middle and upper classes. Picture a London businessman in 1880, leaving his home in the morning. He wears a dark suit, perfectly tailored. A top hat sits precisely on his head, and in his hand, or more likely hooked over his arm when not in use, is his umbrella. Not open, mind you, unless it's actually raining. The properly dressed gentleman carries his umbrella furled, a sleek cylinder of fabric wrapped tight around the shaft, often secured with a strap or button. The way a man carries his furled umbrella says something about him. Too casual, and he seems careless. Too rigid, and he seems pompous. The truly elegant gentleman achieves a perfect balance, the umbrella an extension of himself, as natural as his own arm. By the 1920s and 30s, the transformation is complete. It has become actively uncouth for a professional man to appear in London without his furled umbrella. The umbrella has replaced the walking stick as the gentleman's constant companion. Specialized umbrella makers produce increasingly refined models, ultra-slim designs like the Centenary umbrella introduced by Brigg in the 1930s. So narrow and elegant, it seems almost abstract, more the idea of an umbrella than a functional rain shield. How did this happen? How did an object that inspired violence in the 1750s become absolutely essential by the 1930s? The answer lies partly in practicality, overcoming prejudice, but also in something more subtle. The umbrella stopped being seen as a feminine crutch and started being framed as a mark of civilization itself. A gentleman with an umbrella wasn't weak. He was sensible, forward-thinking, refusing to be defeated by something as trivial as weather. The umbrella became associated not with delicacy but with mastery, with imposing human will upon the chaos of nature. And so the wheel turned full circle. From ancient symbol of divine power in Egypt and China, through centuries as a feminine accessory in Europe, through Jonas Hanway's decades of ridicule, the umbrella arrived at last at its modern identity, the quintessential symbol of of the British gentleman as iconic as tea and queuing and apologizing when someone else bumps into you. As the third story slowly dissolves, let its last words fade into silence. There is nothing left to hold on to now, only a calm, open space. Our story begins in 1571 in the court of Queen Elizabeth I of England. Picture, if you will, the grandeur of Tudor England. Everywhere there is velvet and silk, heavy tapestries hanging from stone walls, the scent of beeswax candles and wood smoke, the rustle of enormous gowns made from yards and yards of precious fabric. And there, at the center of this opulence, sits the Virgin Queen herself, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. Robert Dudley, the first Earl of Leicester, a man who some whisper might have been the Queen's secret love, presents Her Majesty with a gift. It is not a necklace or a ring, though both would have been appropriate. It is something far more unusual, more innovative. A small timepiece, no larger than a walnut, set into an ornate bracelet of gold and precious stones. The craftsmen call it an armed watch, meaning it has an alarm mechanism, a tiny prong that will gently scratch the Queen's wrist at a predetermined time. Imagine the craftsmanship required to create such a thing. The watch movement itself is impossibly small, each gear no bigger than a grain of rice, cut from brass and carefully filed by hand. The balance wheel oscillates back and forth, its tiny pivots resting in jeweled bearings to reduce friction. The whole mechanism must fit within a case perhaps an inch across, leaving room for decoration, for the gold casing, for the small winding crown. And then this miracle of miniaturization must be attached to a bracelet, something that sits against the skin, that moves with the body, that announces its wearer as someone of such importance that even time itself bows to her convenience. But this first wristwatch is an anomaly, a curiosity, a piece as much jewelry as timekeeper. It does not start a trend. For the next 2 centuries and more, watches remain pocket watches, worn by men on chains, kept safe in waistcoat pockets, protected from the elements and from the rough treatment of daily life. Then in 1810, something remarkable happens. Napoleon Bonaparte's sister, Caroline Murat, who has become Queen of Naples through her brother's conquests, commissions a timepiece from Abraham Louis Breguet, perhaps the greatest watchmaker who has ever lived. She doesn't want a pocket watch. She wants something designed specifically for the wrist, something beautiful, something that makes a statement. Picture Breguet in his workshop in Paris. The air carries the scent of watchmaker's oil, that distinctive mineral smell, slightly sweet. His workbench is covered with tools smaller than toothpicks, magnifying glasses of various strengths, movement plates in various states of assembly. He's working on Queen Caroline's commission, and he knows it must be perfect. The case will be oval, elongated to fit the wrist gracefully. Inside, a repeater mechanism, so the Queen can press a button and the watch will chime the hours, allowing her to know the time even in darkness. The whole watch will be mounted on a bracelet of woven hair and gold thread. Incredibly delicate, incredibly expensive. When it's completed in 1812, it's a masterpiece. The case is so thin it seems almost fragile, covered in guilloche engraving that catches the light in waves of pattern. The bracelet sparkles with its gold threads, soft yet strong. This is not a tool. This is a piece of art that happens to tell time. And still, this remains exclusively the domain of women. In 1868, Patek Philippe creates a wristwatch for Countess Koskowitz of Hungary. It's set in a gold bracelet adorned with diamonds. The watch face itself almost hidden among the gems. The movement is baguette-shaped, meaning long and narrow, designed specifically to fit into jewelry rather than adapted from a pocket watch. Feel the weight of such a piece in your imagination. The cool metal against skin, the tiny tick of the balance wheel, so quiet you can barely hear it, like the heartbeat of a very small bird. Throughout the 19th century, this pattern continues. Wristwatches exist, but they are bracelet watches, jewelry that happens to tell time, worn exclusively by wealthy women at court. They are impractical for serious timekeeping. They're too small to be accurate. The movements are finicky, easily disrupted by motion. But they make a statement about the wearer, a woman so refined, so delicate, that even her timepiece must be a piece of jewelry. While women adorned themselves with these wristlet watches, men viewed them with something approaching contempt. A man who wanted to know the time carried a pocket watch, and the more elaborate and expensive, the better. These were serious instruments, with movements housed in heavy gold or silver cases, protected by hinged covers attached to thick chains that fastened to waistcoat buttons. A man's pocket watch announced prosperity, reliability, punctuality, all the virtues of masculine success. The very idea of strapping a watch to one's wrist struck these Victorian and Edwardian gentlemen as absurd. It was feminine, it was delicate, it was, to put it bluntly, unmanly. Worse, it was French, or at least associated with continental affectation, which to British and American men of the time was nearly as damning. By the early 1900s, as some watchmakers began experimenting with wristwatches designed for men, the mockery intensified. Picture a gentleman's club in London, perhaps around 1910. The air is thick with cigar smoke. Leather armchairs creak as portly men in waistcoats settle into them, and someone walks in wearing one of these new wristlet watches, and the room erupts in barely suppressed laughter. Wristlet boys, they called them. The New York Times, in articles from this era, reported that wearing a wristwatch suggested a man had lace on his lingerie, that he probably braided his hair at night. Comedians and social commentators referred to wristwatches as a silly-ass fad, something that would pass as soon as sensible men came to their senses. An article from 1914, just months before World War I would change everything, declared that anyone who wore a wristwatch was probably French, effeminate, ridiculous. The Albuquerque Journal wrote that anyone who wore such a thing would be suspected of the most extreme forms of feminine affectation. This wasn't gentle teasing. This was social ostracism, the kind of mockery that could damage a man's reputation, his business prospects, his standing in society. The resistance wasn't just social. There were practical objections, too. Pocket watches were more accurate, their larger movements less susceptible to the shocks and vibrations of daily life. A wristwatch, by its very nature, would be exposed to the elements, to moisture and dust, to temperature changes that could affect the delicate balance spring that regulated its timing. And beyond all these technical concerns lay the fundamental question: would a real man, a serious man, a masculine man, wear what looked like a bracelet? The answer, in 1913, was an emphatic no. But history was about to deliver a brutal answer of its own. August 1914. War breaks out across Europe. What begins as a conflict expected to be over by Christmas transforms into something the world has never seen before: modern warfare, industrial warfare, trench warfare. Picture the Western Front in the winter of 1915. The landscape has been transformed into something from a nightmare. Where once there were fields and forests, now there are only trenches, zigzagging lines carved into mud, stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland. Between the opposing trenches lies no man's land, a wasteland of barbed wire and shell craters, of mud so deep it can swallow a man whole. And in these trenches live millions of soldiers, young men from Britain, France, Germany, and eventually America, existing in conditions that test the limits of human endurance. The mud is everywhere, a thick, clinging substance that gets into everything, that never truly dries. The smell is indescribable, a mixture of human waste and rotten flesh and cordite from endless artillery bombardments. And the noise, God, the noise, the constant rumble of artillery, the crack of rifle fire, the screams of wounded men. In these conditions, officers quickly discover that pocket watches are worse than useless. Imagine yourself as a young lieutenant, 22 years old, responsible for leading your men over the top in an attack. You're wearing your uniform, muddy and damp, a heavy coat, gloves against the cold. You need to check the time. The attack is synchronized to the minute with an artillery barrage. If you go too early, your own shells will kill you. Too late, and the Germans will have time to man their machine guns. You reach into your coat pocket, fumbling with gloved fingers. Your pocket watch is tangled in the lining. You finally extract it, try to pop open the cover with cold, clumsy hands. It slips, falls into the mud at your feet, and you're scrabbling for it in the darkness because you cannot start the attack without knowing the exact time. This scene played out thousands of times in the early months of the war, and officers, practical men facing death, quickly found a solution. They took their pocket watches and attached them to leather straps, creating improvised wrist watches. Or they purchased purpose-made trench watches from manufacturers who had begun producing them specifically for military use. These trench watches were unlike anything that had come before. They were larger than the delicate ladies' wristlets, with dials perhaps 32 millimeters across. The numbers were oversized Arabic numerals, easy to read at a glance, not the fussy Roman numerals of dress watches. And most importantly, they were luminous. Feel the weight of one of these trench watches on your wrist. The case is steel, not gold, practical, durable, designed for rough treatment. The crystal over the dial is protected by a metal grill like a catcher's mask in miniature to prevent it from shattering when you throw yourself into a trench wall or crawl through barbed wire. The strap is thick leather, strong enough to not break, supple enough to be comfortable even when wet with mud and rain. But the most remarkable feature, the innovation that makes these watches truly essential, is the luminous dial. The numbers and hands are painted with radium mixed with phosphorescent paint, creating a glow that never fades, that requires no charging from sunlight. In the absolute darkness of a pre-dawn attack, you can read your watch by its own light, that eerie green glow, the only source of illumination in the black void of the trench. By 1916, a British military handbook lists the required equipment for officers heading to the front. At the very top of the list, before revolver, before field glasses, before any other piece of equipment, it reads, luminous wristwatch with unbreakable glass. The wristwatch has become more important than weapons because in modern warfare, timing is everything. Artillery barrages are coordinated to the second. Attacks must begin simultaneously along miles of front. The phrase, synchronize your watches, enters the military lexicon, And it's not a suggestion, it's a necessity. Officers gather before an attack, comparing their watches to official time signals, adjusting their minute hands until every watch reads exactly the same time. Picture that moment before an attack. It's 4:19 in the morning. Officers along the trench are raising their wristwatches to eye level, watching the second hand tick through that final minute. 4:19 and 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds. The men around them are ready, rifles loaded, bayonets fixed, every muscle tensed. 4:20. The whistles blow, the barrage lifts, and thousands of men go over the top, their survival depending on the accuracy of those glowing wristwatches strapped to their officers' wrists. This is no longer a feminine bracelet. This is a tool of war, an instrument of survival. By 1917, the British War Office is officially issuing wristwatches to combatants. Manufacturers like Omega, Longines, Elgin, and Waltham are producing them by the thousands. American soldiers entering the war are given wristwatches as part of their welcome package, along with a pound of tobacco. The transformation is complete, though nobody quite realizes it yet. What was mocked as a silly feminine fad in 1910 is now standard military equipment in 1918. What men wouldn't be caught dead wearing in peacetime, they now consider as essential as their rifles. The blood and mud of the trenches has washed away every trace of the feminine stigma. When the war ends in November 1918, millions of soldiers return home, and they bring their wristwatches with them. These men, these veterans who have survived the most terrible conflict in human history, continue wearing their trench watches. And suddenly, no one is laughing. No one is making jokes about lace lingerie or braided hair. How could they? These watches are worn by heroes, by men who charged through machine gun fire, who lived for months in conditions that would break most civilians. The wristwatch has been baptized in blood and mud. It carries the weight of survival, the authority of proven utility. To mock it now would be to mock the men who wore it in battle. Picture a veteran walking down Main Street in any American town in 1919. He's wearing civilian clothes now, but on his wrist, clearly visible, is his trench watch. Maybe it's battered, the crystal scratched, the leather strap worn and stained, but he wears it with pride. It kept him alive. It coordinated the attacks that won the war. It's a symbol of his service, his sacrifice, his membership in that brotherhood of men who went through hell and came back. Other men see this and understand. The pocket watch suddenly seems old-fashioned, cumbersome, a relic of a more innocent time. The wristwatch is modern, practical, forward-thinking. Within a few years, watch manufacturers have completely shifted their focus. By the 1920s, wristwatches outsell pocket watches for the first time. By the 1930s, the transformation is complete. A businessman without a wristwatch looks as out of place as one without shoes. The language changes too. Wristlet disappears from common usage, replaced by wristwatch. Manufacturers no longer emphasize delicacy and decoration, but durability and precision. Rolex introduces the Oyster case in 1926, completely waterproof, dustproof, a watch that can withstand anything. The marketing is explicitly masculine. These are tools, instruments, equipment for serious men leading active lives. And so the wheel turns full circle. The wristwatch, born as a queen's jeweled bracelet, mocked for centuries as hopelessly feminine, has become the ultimate symbol of 20th century masculinity. All it took was the worst war the world had ever seen. And so our journey through time comes to its quiet end. From hand-stitched garments worn by candlelight to mass-produced clothes filling modern closets, your wardrobe has traveled a long and surprising path. It reminds us that nothing we wear is ever just fabric. Every seam carries a moment, every fold remembers a body, and every piece holds a fragment of a life once lived. As you drift towards sleep now, perhaps you'll dream of silk brushing softly against skin, of wool warming someone on a winter morning, of old coats hanging patiently in forgotten closets, and of all the quiet stories our clothes carry through time. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd love it if you could give this video a like and subscribe to Pillow Trace for more gentle journeys into history, memory, and dreams. Until next time, rest well and dream deep.